thanks Michael and Jana for the invitation. Thanks for this presentation. Okay, I will begin. The title is of the materialism of the idea. In the conclusion to his second manifesto for philosophy, Badiou presents the difference between this manifesto and the first as follows. If the first manifesto constantly stresses the triplet of being, the subject, and truth, the second manifesto emphasizes the effective appearance of this triplet as well as its observable action in the world. In the first manifesto, if the first manifesto reaffirmed the possibility and necessity of the continuing existence of philosophy, the second is dedicated to its revolutionary pertinence. And finally, the first manifesto rests as regards truths, I quote Badiou, upon a separatist doctrine of being, the second upon an integrative doctrine of doing. In the passage from a ontology of true universality of the first manifesto to an pragmatic of its becoming of the second, one can isolate two theses. With regard to the contemporary world, it's a question of the victorious renewal of the communist hypothesis. This question is inseparable from the theme of the authentic life, which is nothing other than a life marked by the idea. Here I will advance the following thesis, which will be the main thread of my intervention. The task of the idea with which a philosophy operates is to reinforce the materialist orientation of this philosophy. It is the materialism of a world which, to borrow Badiou's words, has no below external to it, no pre-world matter, so to speak. Neither does it have any heterogeneous above. This is from the Logique des Mondes. In order to develop this thesis, I will first do some groundwork. First, to conceive the idea in the sense Badiou introduced this concept, one must begin from the indiscernibility of thought and act. The idea is only possible under the form of a prescription, to live according to idea, or again, to act according to the idea. The idea should be theorized as a point of the indiscernibility of thought and act. Secondly, this indiscernibility of thought and act requires that there be joined to the initial couple thought and act at third instance, that of the real or the thing. It is precisely the instance of the real that opens the way towards the materialism of the idea. To formulate this point in a more rigorous manner, I would say that the theorization of the idea as a point of indiscernibility of thought and act requires a conceptual articulation that has been elaborated by the Lacanian psychoanalysis, an articulation on the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, and which Badiou, with some modification, has appropriated. To provide philosophy with its materialist foundation, we would need a noting of these three instances. Thirdly, The materialism of the idea requires also a singular figure of the subject. A subject which still remains to use the vocabulary of the first manifesto, a subject without a vis-a-vis, but this figure of the subject without the object, an additional turn of the screw must be added. While remaining the subject without the object, it is not without. And to be even more precise, it is precisely not without an object. Here I am paraphrasing Lacan's thesis according to which anxiety, I join here Frank, to which anxiety, that affect, namely, which does not deceive us, although it is without a determinable object, is not without the object. I quote Lacan, it, namely, anxiety, is not without the object, on condition, however, that we cannot say which object is at stake here. The end of the quotation. This is precisely the reason why anxiety does not deceive us. It cannot be doubted. It does not deceive us precisely to the extent that all objects escape it. It is precisely in this paradoxical object which goes together with the subject without the object, in that object which is there although one cannot see it as a usual, objective object, that we should look for the materiality of that exceptional body, exceptional precisely insofar as it is subjectivizable, this object that Badiou has introduced under the name of the body of truth. As a point of indiscernibility between thought and act, the idea, far from guaranteeing the passage of theory to praxis, consists rather in a breaching of the symbolic in the direction of the real. We find an indication for how to elucidate this point in Badiou himself when he defines the idea as an, I quote, operative mediation between the real and the symbolic. It is from the communist hypothesis. Badiou describes it more precisely in the following terms. I quote, "The idea is an historical fixation of that which is fleeting, subtracted, and ungraspable in the becoming of a truth. But it is such only insofar as it recognizes this aleatory, fleeting, subtracted, and ungraspable dimension." This is also the communist hypothesis. And it is to do justice to the real of the idea that I would supplement Badiou's statement that the idea, I quote, is that on the basis of which individuals represent to themselves the world and themselves within it, once they are incorporated into a thought process, as follows. The idea, even before appearing as a representation of the world, is the articulation of the real, or more precisely, the real which, in the case of the idea, can be designated as the thing of thought. The idea is the manifestation of the fact that philosophical thought is affected, marked by a thing that thought cannot appropriate, although it belongs to it. I can now rewrite the thesis with which I began, and according to which the idea is founded on the indiscernibility of thought and act as follows. The idea is structured as an act which puts into play the thing of thought that is the real point, which, all the while remaining irreducible to thought, permits thought to constitute itself as a true thought. Before I could explain my starting assumption in more details, I will return briefly to the triad of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, three fundamental categories or principles of classification. From a strictly Lacanian perspective, we could say that with these three categories we have all we can get, as they are all we can have at our disposal. It is only by means of this triad that there can be for us something like a world. Firstly, the world is nothing but the presence of some symbolic structure which constitutes and at the same time regulates our reality. Secondly, our world is given to us, or rather, we live and experience it through representation as an eminently imaginary category. And thirdly, to say, as Lacan does, that our reality is nothing but a montage of the symbolic structure and imaginary representation is to say something lacks this reality. Indeed, something which for this reality to be possible at all necessary falls out, namely the real. There is then nothing else, nothing that would be left outside, escape these three principles of classification. For this triad constitutes a knot. The symbolic structure that holds together reality and ultimately governs it is always already organized around something that drops out of it. The condition of the possibility for the emergence of reality is the exclusion of the real, which in turn becomes impossible. Put simply, without this excluded instance, there would be no symbolically organized world. From the very beginning, we are dealing thus with the one that divides into two, an impossible two, to be sure, insofar as the symbolic is accompanied by something which is heterogeneous to it, yet which accompanies it like an invisible shadow. Its internal exteriority, or the real. To the dyad of the symbolic and the real, the imaginary is added as the third, the visible shadow. My claim is that this adding has a specific function. The imaginary is not only the way in which we experience the symbolically ordered reality, as I mentioned before. The imaginary is also a specific manner in which the dropout of the real from the symbolic is thought and staged, literally mise en scène in reality. For the dropping out of the real could be either negated or repressed, even tacitly admitted. But the immanent exception of the real can be manifested also as something which, while being radically heterogeneous to reality, functions within reality. In other words, it is by means of the knotting of three instances, RSI, that it is possible to affirm within reality the trace of the real, the trace of something that interrupts reality either by lacking in reality or by exceeding reality. My claim is that the Badiousian idea is precisely a way of making a knot with RSI, in fact, reality, such that it is organized by the idea, is a derealized reality. We are dealing here with reality that is organized around an instance that renders it inconsistent. But precisely because of this, it opens up the possibility of the emergence of something which is universal, emancipatory, and in a world destined to all. And it is universal, emancipatory, insofar as it is separated from the time of the situation in which it takes place, that is to say, precisely as this hors-lieu, outside space, and hors temps, outside time. To borrow one of Badiou's earlier formulation, one could say that the idea realizes an itinerary of an integral materialism, I quote, from the real as cause to the real as consistency. It is from the theory of subject. This itinerary of the integral materialism could be formulated as follows. What makes it that the real as a presupposition is always already produced as a surplus product of an orientation of life according to the truth is the idea. Yet this paradoxical internal externality or extimacy of the real appears to be crucial. There is an aspect to the Badiousian notion of the idea that is of particular interest to me. What this notion brings out is that the idea is as though is affected by the real of the think of thought, and at the same time thinks it being affected. Of course, there is no true thought without that which affects it, without the think of thought. But the nothing of thought and its real remains something constructed. To think this being affected obviously is not to be confused with a contemplative position. The idea is a point of indiscernibility between thought and act, and we are dealing here with an act that consists in materializing, that is to say, to bringing to the appearance in the world this thing of thought that affects thought in its intimacy. This materialization of thought that the idea effects is to be understood in two senses of the word. It materializes thought by giving it, so to speak, its primary material, that is, by constructing a minimal difference between thought and the thing which affects thought in its interiority, by allowing in thus to the thought of something which is heterogeneous to it. But it materializes the thought by organizing the appearance of the thing of thought in the guise of a body of truth in a world. From this perspective, one could say that it is the thing of thought and not thought as such which is the origin and cause of the indiscernibility between act and thought as the mode of functioning of the idea. The operation which allows the idea to think it's being affected to the extent that it materializes its think of thought in the world can be compared to a passage in the Lacanian psychoanalysis from the object of desire to the object cause of desire, an object that sets desire in motion. It is precisely this passage which allows one to find out if one wants what one desires. Here I draw on Lacan's conclusive note remarks on the relation of Daniel Lagache in his Écrit, where Lacan insists on the fact that, I quote, the subject is called to be reborn as object R of desire in order to know what it desires. Hence, a constitutive part of the gesture to want one's desire is always also the desire to see. A desire to see what exactly? A desire to see the ungraspable object cause of desire as being as such materialized in the world. Let me illustrate this with an example. There is perhaps no better illustration for the indiscernibility of thinking and acting than the famous Robespierre's question, "Citizen, would you want a revolution without a revolution?" It is precisely this binding together of the revolution and desire with the desire for the revolution, to be precise, that is implied in Robespierre's question, which assures that what is at work in a revolution is truly a revolution. Or, put differently, it is the desire for the revolution which signals that we are dealing here with a truly revolutionary revolution, a moment of a radical interruption, a radically contingent political action which transforms the regime of possibility and visibility of a given situation by bringing out that which is the non-representable, invisible, in short, the impossible of that situation, the abyss of an absence. The desire evoked in Robespierre's question, far from being a psychological category, is rather inseparable from the revolution. Indeed, in this sense, it could be understood as a strictly political category. It is a desire for the revolution in a twofold sense. On the one hand, it provides the revolution with its truly revolutionary character. On the other, it is itself as desire determined by the revolution. In effect, a true revolution implies in itself a revolution in the modes of desiring, a revolutionizing of desire itself. In what then consists such a revolution in desiring, a revolution of desire? I would say that it consists in the fact that a desire for the revolution can only be set in motion if it itself desired. Only those who want their desire for the revolution are capable of effectuating the revolution with a revolution. In a word, Robespierre's demand that a revolution must be desired with a revolution can be understood At least this is how I try to read it, as a demand that we desire itself. Thus Robespierre's questions, do you want a revolution without a true revolution, could be understood as the question, do you desire a desire without a true desire? Or again, do you truly want what you desire? A true revolutionary is not simply someone who thinks and declares, be it so passionately, that he wants the revolution. Indeed, we should be suspicious of such a revolutionary, as his desire is simply a psychological category rather than a strictly revolutionary category. For he may well desire a revolution today, only to chuck it tomorrow for something else equally passionately desired, say, a good job in the state apparatus. A genuine revolutionary is therefore only one who desires not simply a revolution, but desires in addition, so to speak, his or her desire for the revolution. This also explains why it is difficult to make such a revolutionary to deviate from its revolutionary path. In brief, for a true revolution, desire is not enough. It is not enough to desire a revolution. Rather, the one who works for the revolutionary cause must, in addition, desire his or her desire for the revolution. And this supplement of the desire, of the wanted, of this we must want, our desire, is the moment of courage. I think so. At this point, I would like to introduce a few propositions, leaving their more elaborate justification for another time. To summarize my previous point, I would say that the operation of wanting one's desire is an operation of the depsychologization of desire. Depsychologized desire is namely a conjunction, a union of thought and affect, or rather, it is a thought insofar as it is affected precisely by the sink of thought at its object cause, as its object cause. More precisely, it is a thought that thinks it affection by the real, this being, of course, its object cause. The operation of wanting desire, a desire for the revolution, is an act that renders visible in the world the real object cause that affects thought, or which amounts to the same, the desire for the revolution. This also explains why a desire for the revolution cannot be separated from a desire to see the revolution. In itself, it is the answer to the question, how can a revolution be seen, and that precisely as a revolution? That is, as a moment of a radical interruption, which in what there is, invokes the abyss of the absence. For my part, the answer can only be the following. The revolution can be seen if and only if, when looking at it, we also want to see. That is to say, it very process of looking, we participate in it with our desire to see. Robespierre's question can then be reformulated for those who don't see any possibility whatever for the revolution today as follows. Citizens, would you want to see a revolution without the desire to see? The desire to see, in its elementary form, manifests itself as a desire to see something there where at first sight there is nothing to be seen. It is a desire to see the nothing as something. But this precisely is a fundamental characteristic of revolutionary politics of emancipation. It is a politics that sees something, the possibility of a radical change in a given situation, there where the situation renders it impossible to see anything, more precisely, to see nothing but the possibilities given by the situation itself. Yet the revolutionary politics implies the desire to see in two inseparable meanings. Firstly, it is a desire to see the possibility of a new state of the situation precisely in the place of a given situation. And secondly, it is a desire to make visible, to materializes in this new state of the situation that which is not and can never be seen as an object vis-à-vis, as an objective object. The emergence of the new, that which is not and can not be present as an ordinary material. A true revolution, a revolution with a revolution, is a revolution that we see in these two senses. But we can see it in such a way because we want, but we can see it in such a way because we want to see. Because we have the courage to see. Another way of putting this would be to state that what is at work in this desire to see is the process of subjectivation. It is by wanting one's desire for the revolution, that one becomes a subject. It is a process in which, in an always singular way, the appearance of the real cause of desire, the revolution, is made possible. To see the revolution, or to see the revolution with a revolution, is nothing other than to see politics as a process of political subjectivation, which in turn means to see how in the field of politics, where usually there is nothing to see but statist agents and apparatuses, appears a subject, or to be even more precise, we appear as a subject. We are dealing here with a subject that appears as a product of a desire to see. This desire to see, understood as an inseparability of thought and act. We could then say with Badiou that the subject is the subjectivation, and add this subjectivation is also a noting of a subject without object, with a specific, while unworldly materiality. To conclude, I said before that the desire for the revolution is not a psychological, but rather a political category. Now I would add to this, the desire for the revolution is in fact an ontological category. In a given world, it functions as an idea, as an instance of the indiscernibility of thought and act, through which is, step by step, point by point, create a specific materiality the transworldly and transtemporal materiality of the idea of the revolution, or to be quite precise, of the communist idea. One can say with this transworldly materiality, which functions at the same time as an element of the world, the political subject is reborn. Thank you.